trade decreases migration, creates strong partners and allies. When used improperly, it has the opposite effect on both our friends and adversaries and wastes taxpayers' money. I became a strong proponent of reforming international assistance by working in a bipartisan and bicameral fashion with my co-sponsors, along with the first Trump administration when we introduced the BUILD Act that authorized the creation of the DFC. This was the largest reform in foreign aid in over 2 decades, and my goal was to move countries from aid to trade with the use of effective tools managed correctly. I chaired, along with Congressman Adam Smith, the Effective Aid Caucus and met with members and outside groups to improve efficiency and effectiveness on assistance. This committee has had many hearings dealing with USAID. It's frustrating that an agency set up to further our security, prosperity, engage in humanitarian projects, and work to prevent the spread of diseases, hunger, and conflict have strayed so far from its original intent when it was created under President Kennedy in 1961. USAID has lost the trust of a large portion of the American people and the international community. Remember, President Lincoln, he said, with public support, you can do almost anything. Without it, you can't do anything. The redesigned U.S. foreign assistance entity will have to work hard to recreate that trust here and abroad. Many new reforms are necessary in USAID. There are many ways reform can be performed. And many administrations, and as I heard here today, Congresses have acknowledged this, yet we did not act. The Trump administration acted, and there's a lot of angst and concerns about who has authority, how's it going to be done. Those debates will go on as long as people want to debate, criticize, and complain. President Trump and Secretary Rubio stated the objectives of international aid very clearly moving forward. Does it make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? It'll serve the nation, our security, and economy, as well as developing nations and our allies to get new reforms in place as soon as possible. Not all aid is bad, nor is it all good. We should focus on those programs that are good and make them better and more effective. Programs that were misused and not aligned with the administration should be eliminated. Congress should look to support programs that have a proven track record of success, and there are many examples to look at, and I'll be happy to discuss those. Moving forward, I would recommend the Trump administration place aid into 2 categories. First, the hard infrastructure projects like road, water, energy, transportation. These are the projects that are necessary to build an economy in the recipient country so we can wean them off of aid. The U.S. government has instruments like the DFC, MCC, tasked with the heavy lifting in initial phases of a project by providing risk insurance, technical assistance, and expertise, and brings in outside investors and other nations' DFIs. Second, the humanitarian side of assistance via a repurposed USAID type entity working synergistically with the DFC and other USG agencies. Feed the Future, African Growth, and Opportunity Act are effective health and food security programs when implemented properly and generate much soft power goodwill. Unfortunately, if mismanaged, we lose credibility, money, and drive the affected nations to our adversaries. By pausing U.S. international assistance, a vacuum is created. China, Russia, or other are already moving in to fill those voids. The U.S. must quickly bring back the authorization, funding, and a knowledgeable workforce to implement those programs that align with the administration's goal. Does it make America safer, stronger, and more prosperous? One last point. By not being effectively present can be arguably worse than pausing a program. And all you have to do is look at South and Central America and look at how much we've ceded to China and their influence from Russia, China, and Iran. That has to be dealt with immediately. That's a national security threat. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I yield back my time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I now recognize Mr. Natsios for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I speak for myself today. I've been involved in humanitarian work and development work.
Let's try that microphone one more time. Maybe pull it a little closer.
Okay, how's that?
Much better.
Better, okay. I speak for myself today. I don't represent anyone. And I've been doing this work since 1989 when I joined the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, as the director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, when the world order was collapsing. And our little office, along with the Food for Peace office, saved tens of millions of lives around the world, which they continued to do through the BHA Bureau, which is now much larger than it was when I was there. If you're upset about getting off course, so am I. But let's course correct, not course destroy. When I took over AID as the administrator in Bush 43, W's administration, in early 2001, I ordered my deputy to begin reviewing every single project, every single program in AID, line by line, and we eliminated 80 programs over a month. And we moved that cash back into the program because there was a cassava mosaic that was destroying the cassava crop in Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Eastern Congo. And there was a risk of a famine. And we got cuttings in, and we stopped the pandemic, the disease pandemic for the cassava. My point is, I eliminated a lot of philosophically offensive programs that a conservative administration would not tolerate. And when the Democrats took over, they moved the agency to the left. I moved it to the right. The Obama people actually said I was very right-wing. I was the most right-wing administrator in the history of the agency, and yet the career people followed what I wanted to do in the agency. We put heavy emphasis on economic growth. Some of the things you've criticized, sir, with all due respect, are economic growth programs that have been highly successful. 10% of the workforce in Egypt is from tourism. AID has properly invested $100 million over the years, and it's massively increased the number of jobs in Egypt. They are our ally. Don't we want people working instead of being unemployed? It is 12% of the GDP of Egypt, tourism. We call it development tourism. We do it in Lebanon, we do it in Tunisia, we've done it in Kosovo and in Bosnia, we've done it in Morocco, we do it all over the world. It brings in revenue and employs people. It's an economic growth project. I believe in economic growth. I believe in the private sector. I believe in free markets. That's what AID does. The notion that AID is some kind of a Marxist institution is absolutely ridiculous, okay? I know the career officers. I work with them. There is a career track called the private sector officers. And what do? They work with the business community. I started a program which the Democrats continued called the Global Development Alliance. We started it very early on, 2001. What it does is it matches AID money with corporate money to supply their supply chains. We do this all over the world. We're working with hundreds of American corporations. We've raised $60 billion in private sector funding with the American business community to increase jobs all over the world. We've been doing this for 24 years, very successfully. The Europeans and the Canadians and the Australians have taken our lead in this and tried to replicate these public-private alliances. 25% of the money in those GDAs is U.S. government money. 75% is private money. We invest together. We don't give them any money. They don't give us any money. We design the project, we co-invest, and then we manage it. The notion that AID is irresponsible in terms of its oversight is utter nonsense. I wrote an essay 12 years ago called The Clash of the Counter-Bureaucracy and Development. It was published. It's the most cited thing I've written in the scholarly literature. And it was based on my frustration with the level over and over and over again of oversight. The Inspector General, the Special Inspector General. Why do we need two Inspector Generals in Afghanistan and in Iraq? Then we have the GAO, we have the OMB, we have the Congressional Oversight Committee. Every line of what AID does is overseen by 7 different levels of oversight. You know why money disappears? I'll tell you why. Where do we work? Where do we work? Christian NGOs are now delivering food in Sudan in a famine. There will be 2 million people dead by the end of this year. Those are the projections. There is no government in Sudan. There's no police in Sudan. There are no courts.
I thank you for your opening remarks this morning. And I now recognize Chairman Emeritus, Ranking Member Meeks, for his 5 minutes of questioning. Chairman Emeritus McCall for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was chairman of this committee, I got congressional notifications of spending programs from USAID and State Department, and I put holds on those programs, many listed by the chairman. Instead of working with me, the administration, the prior Biden administration, decided to blow through those holds, bucking a long-standing tradition. And I want to go through some of those I put on hold. $1.5 million to promote LGBTQ causes for immigrants in Latin America, allowing them to litigate against foreign governments, primarily Catholic nations. I don't know how that advances the U.S. interests abroad. And as a Catholic myself, I find that very offensive. We've also heard about the $15 million for condoms and contraceptives to Afghanistan, a country under Sharia law, $15 million. What did USAID do? They blew through my holds in complete and utter disregard of this committee's oversight responsibilities. I also uncovered the department had spent $500,000 to advance atheism in Nepal. Atheism in a country where Tibetan Buddhists is a predominant religion. What does that have to do with advancing U.S. interest abroad? The Humanist International Group that they gave money to, the $500,000, the CEO called the Catholic Church an institution you should be ashamed to be involved with. Our taxpayer dollars to condemn the Catholic Church. Again, as a Catholic, I find that extremely offensive. And then the one we've heard so much about, $20,000 for drag shows and drag workshops in Ecuador. Mr. Chairman, I've seen the video you sent out. It is utterly disgusting to the American taxpayer that we are funding that kind of behavior. All these programs gave USAID a black eye. And that's unfortunate. Because you go back to the Marshall Plan, really the genesis for thinking about USAID. The Marshall Plan was one of the most successful programs we endeavored in after World War II to make sure a Hitler never rose from the ashes again. The Food for Peace program, sir, that you discussed, the American farmer benefits from this. It's been extremely successful. Why was USAID created in the first place in 1961? It was to counter the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I believe it still has a legitimate purpose to counter the rising threat of China and Belt and Road and our other foreign adversaries. It also has the ability to counter terrorism. Lindsey Graham and I passed the Global Fragility Act, state, DOD, USAID, all working together to stabilize, destabilize nations which breed terrorism. PEPFAR, one of the most successful global health programs ever developed under President Bush. Yet all of this is called into question because of the irresponsibility of the Biden administration's woke agenda and policies. Mr. Yoho, we've been friends. We work together, colleagues. Your greatest legacy is the BUILD Act, and we need to reinforce that policy as well. But when you look at the core mission, all these programs need to go, and they will be gone. But as we look at program by program and strip down to the core mission, do you still believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor, the core mission of USAID?
I do. I think what you see over a period of time is a mission creep. You know, these programs were designed with purity of purpose. This is what they're supposed to do. And when you get mission creep, you get these things that we're seeing, and they're indefensible, some of the programs that you guys mentioned. And that loses trust, like you said. And in business, what I've learned, and I think everybody can agree with this, people like to do business with people they know, they like, and they trust. If that's true with us on a business setting, it's the same in nations. If other nations know us, they like us, and they trust us, they're going to do business with us. And we've heard this over and over again. You know, it's been brought up by other leaders that.
And can I just ask my time,
Sure.
is it in our national security interest to maintain the core mission, and I would argue under the State Department for proper supervision?
Yes, it is, and if we don't do that, we cede that leadership to
I yield
other
back.
people.
I now recognize Ranking Member Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I too am a chairman emeritus of this committee, and I can recall where President Trump, when he was the president, blew past some of my things that I wanted to hold. In fact, he's blown past some already in this term. So that's just the will of what presidents do at times in that regards. But in this instance, 93 missions, every one has been closed. Every one. That's not trying to fix something. That's destroying something. But let me just stop there, because one of the reasons why I asked Mr. Nacios to testify here, because he is a lifelong Republican, and he understands the insides and the outsides of running USAID. More so than anybody, no disrespect to anybody that's on this panel. He's the one that has done it. And I will admit, we don't agree on certain things. Democrats and Republicans don't agree. Some things that Republicans do that I believe is full of waste, destructive, but if they win the elections, they have a choice to try to move it in that direction. When Democrats win, what we stand for, we move in our direction. That's part of having a free democratic society. We're not Russia. So I want to put the politics aside for this discussion and ask Mr. Nacios, can you explain to the committee why you believe foreign assistance and the work of USAID, as you've done so, is so essential, and you feel so passionately enough about it that you did respond? Because I've seen administrators, Democrats and Republicans alike, who have worked at USAID alike, come out against closing USAID. Can you tell us that today?
Well, let me tell you two stories. One story is my last month at AID. No one knew except my wife I was going to leave and teach at Georgetown. And this was December of 2005. And I always would get a briefing from the director of counterterrorism at the CIA. And he came in to see me and he said, Mr. Nacios, the chatter is you're coming and they're going to attempt to assassinate you. I said, who? He said, well, obviously the Taliban. I said, why are they going to assassinate me? Because you're the head of AID. They can't deal with AID. They can deal with the military. They just shoot each other. But they can't build health clinics. We built 400 health clinics. We got the child mortality rates and the maternal mortality rates down by a third. It took 7 years to do that, but we did it very successfully. And we opened schools. We published 90 million textbooks in the schools to get the kids back in school. And the Taliban can't deal with that. They're going to try, and we advise you not to go. I said, well, let me think about that. But if you do go, announce you've arrived as you're stepping on the plane to leave. I said, what? He said, announce when you're stepping on the plane to leave, announce you've arrived. So in other words, they won't know you're there. So I went, I decided to go, and nothing happened, and I did what he suggested. But what I found out was, from talking to the mullahs in the village, the religious leaders who were pro-democracy and pro-America, that the Taliban disregarded the greatest enemy of the Taliban was USAID. You know, in Kosovo, they named their kids USAID. They actually, the Albanians are Muslims in Kosovo, and this Muslim, they made it into a Muslim name, USAID. If you go to the refugee camps and displaced camps around the world, USAID is the image of the United States. We used to bring 20,000 students to the United States to get their advanced degrees during the Cold War. You know what the Chinese, you know what we're doing now? 900 scholarships. We stopped doing it. The Chinese are spending huge amounts of money to bring 40,000 people from the developing world to get their degrees in China. We should be investing in that. We're not. And I think we're falling behind, and we're focused on the wrong things. The amount of DEI stuff. I started going through the RFAs. It's a small percentage. It is not accurate to say that this is, and some of these things that have been shown, those are not AID projects. Those are State Department programs. Why are you blaming AID for what the State Department did? The F office in state controls all this stuff. Now let me tell you a second story. After the Aceh tsunami, we did a huge response. Aceh is a part of Indonesia, which had a Muslim insurgency for many years against the central government. We did a huge response. We put the aid logo on everything. The mission director got carried away, 50,000 stickers, USAID from the American people. Before the Aceh tsunami, bin Laden had a 57% approval rating in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world and a democracy. After it, he collapsed from 57% to 27%. We had a 26% approval rating. We went from 26% to 63%. Now you say, Americans like to be liked. We all like to be liked. But what difference does it make? President Yudhoyono, the president of the country, said, I like President Bush. I like the United States, but it's very hard to work with you because you're so unpopular. Not after the Aceh tsunami. The newspapers in Indonesia said, where is bin Laden? When we need him. The Americans here we really don't like, and now we realize who our real friends are.
Thank you for answering our questions today, sir. We appreciate it. We agree. A lot of waste, like $10 million through USAID. Everything I listed was USAID. $10 million for circumcision in Mozambique. There's another example for you. I now recognize Mr. Smith from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Upon assuming office, President Biden repealed President Ronald Reagan's Mexico City policy, expanded by President Donald Trump in 2017. But the Biden administration didn't stop there. They initiated a new, radical vision that integrated aggressive abortion on demand into PEPFAR programming, called it Reimagining PEPFAR, that included explicit guidance directing recipients, and this is billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer funds, to use their leverage to enact pro-abortion laws and policies in PEPFAR countries. Biden hijacked PEPFAR. And he shattered, I did the reauthorization of PEPFAR for 5 years during the Trump administration, the first one. I'm all for it. In this place here and on the floor of the House and all over Africa as I traveled, all for it. But then it was hijacked. In a strong rebuke, and Mr. Max had mentioned this earlier, 131 African lawmakers and religious leaders said that the PEPFAR funding is supporting abortion, and they admonished us to say the NGOs that we finance are hijacking their ideals by pushing it so aggressively in Africa. Mr. Natsios, you testified today, and I read your written statement, that USAID needs to be refashioned, and you said that, quote, you believe it is bad policy to transfer domestic culture wars into politics to the developing world. Do you believe that the Biden administration was wrong to integrate abortion on demand into global health? Because they did it across the board, USAID, and of course PEPFAR. Much of that money is deployed through USAID. When you did say that efforts to protect the weakest and most vulnerable from extermination, I do believe that's trivialized when you somehow bottom line it and say it's a culture war. We believe in defending unborn children and their mothers from the violence of abortion. It's not a culture war. It is a fact when they're in these countries pushing it, that unfortunately children will die. I and like-minded pro-life advocates in Congress and around the world seek to protect unborn baby girls and boys from violence of abortion, including dismemberment, decapitation, and of course the abortion pills, which are now being pushed all over the world, including the United States. How do they work? They starve the baby to death. That's how it works. So, I'm all for global. We did two bipartisan. I was the prime sponsor of it, Global Food Security Acts. I'm all for mitigating global hunger. But when you turn around and say to an entire segment of humanity, unborn children, we're going to starve you to death through these abortion pills, To me, that's unconscionable. So do you agree that pro-abortion NGOs should continue to be empowered and subsidized with billions of dollars each year by the American taxpayer to promote abortion with the goal of changing pro-life laws in these nations? And I would ask all three of our witnesses.
Congressman, you can check my voting record in Massachusetts. I 100%, and in Massachusetts, this is in Massachusetts, I had 100% pro-life voting record for 12 years in the House.
Right.
So my position is very clear, and I took a lot of heat from the feminist groups in Massachusetts, and my views have not changed. I called you once because we found them doing vaginal scraping in Bangladesh in a remote village, and the mission director called me immediately. He said, we discovered this, we put a stop to it, Andrew, because if you do that and the woman is pregnant, the child dies, okay? And you're supposed to check before you do it. They weren't trained properly. They weren't doing it maliciously. They just didn't understand because they weren't trained properly. We fixed it very quietly. I called you up and told you what happened. We were being transparent about it. Other than that, that's the only violation we had in the 5 years that I was aid administrator. The career people will do what they're told to do. I am appalled at what you're telling me that they have done. And by dragging AID into these culture wars, the Biden administration has undermined the need for bipartisan support for AID. We cannot tolerate in an agency with programs all over the world a war between parties, which I'm seeing right now. In my view, it's a failure. All of the things I did at AID, I tried to do it in a way that would not alienate the Democratic Party when I left. If you look before they took apart the agency, everything I created is still there, was still there. They left it in place.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time. The other two distinguished witnesses. Thank you, Andrew.
Congressman, everything that we did during the first Trump administration, and I had these senior positions, we worked very hard to make sure that everything that we did had bipartisan support. What I've seen with the last administration is actually breaking the law, because you're not supposed to. By law, you're not supposed to. And I think the PEPFAR coordinator has stressed that point. But when you fund International Planned Parenthood, when you fund UN agencies that openly promote it, and when the Africans themselves tell you it's happening, then the law is being broken. I hope that the second Trump administration pursues the pro-life policies that it had in the first one, but also to include humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
When we set these policies forward, it's going to behoove all of us, and this is hard to do. These policies should be what's best for America. If it's best for America, it's going to be best for the rest of the world. And those policies are based on our beliefs as a nation. If we're a Christian nation, as we always talk about, that's the right thing to do. And I think we need to stay that way. And the hard part is, with us in this body, we have to keep the checks on that. If not, it goes away. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear the conversation about university spending as well, because there's a lot of that within USAID also. $42 million for Johns Hopkins to research and drive social behavior, and $250,000 for FIU for DEI training, and $244,000 for Stanford to do leadership training, not life-saving programs. I now recognize Mr. Sherman from California.
Foreign aid is a good thing. Americans think that we spend 25% of the federal budget on foreign aid and want it reduced to 10%. But the fact is, it's way less than 1%. It helps us challenge China in the world. It reduces not only hunger, but migration to our borders. And it helps us fight communicable diseases over there before they mutate and come here, and that's why Ronald Reagan recognized the importance of foreign aid. Mr. Chairman, my fear, because I've been here for a long time, when I got here, it wasn't just Democrats against Republicans, it was the legislative branch against the executive branch. And we need to play that role, and as the ranking member points out, we need to have government witnesses here so we can talk about the future rather than just be a cheering squad for the executive branch. But I want to bring to your attention, Mr. Chairman, an action taken by the State Department today that was too woke for Sherman. They announced that they're going to spend $400 million on zero greenhouse gas emitting armored cars. That's right, electric armored cars, $400 million to replace perfectly good gas-driven armored cars. They said they were going to be Tesla Cybertruck armored cars. This administration will get too woke for Sherman if it helps the shareholders of the Tesla automobile. There have been a number of falsehoods stated. The biggest one is the $50 million for Gaza condoms. Musk admitted that it was just completely false. He apologized. So that Doge made a mistake. Are we going to terminate Doge? Well, I'd like to, but we're going to terminate Doge because it made one mistake? No. You identify mistakes that are a lot less than $50 million, people want to terminate USAID. Musk statement he should be apologizing for and publicizing because the truth has a tough time catching up with the falsehood. But let's go through a few others. We're told that there's $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt. Mr. Nasios, you would demonstrate how that's a good program. We should give credit to Donald Trump for that program. He started it under his first administration. Now it's being attacked. We're told that circumcision is terrible. It's a very cheap operation. It's only done voluntarily. It's been done by Democratic and Republican administrations, including Trump. Why? Because it's a 60% reduction in the risk of female-to-male transmission of HIV. We were told that USAID was spending $80 million on subscriptions to Politico. No, the entire executive branch was doing that. But you know who else spends money on Politico? Republicans in Congress who spend $800,000 of their office budget on Politico. And Mr. Chairman, you didn't spend any money on Politico. Like me, you spent your money on Bloomberg, as do I. Of course, Michael Waltz spent his money, over $8,000 on Politico just for his own office. The list goes on and on. But we are told that there's waivers for all this. Well, PEPFAR has been allowed to work, but they have no access to funds. But what doesn't get a waiver is democracy programs, and we need democracy in Iran. Education programs and economic development. So it's okay under Trump to give a hungry man a fish, but it's illegal to spend $1 to teach him to fish or to tell him how to get a fishing pole. And under that, we'll be feeding hungry Egyptians forever because they won't have the tourism so that they can buy their food on the world market. We need education, we need democracy, we need economic development. Finally, there's a sad incident. 71-year-old Pei Kao Lau. She was able to survive and flee from Myanmar to Thailand. She was in a camp with over 10,000 people. They cut off the money and they cut off her oxygen, and she died. And no future waiver is going to bring her back to life. Mr. Chairman, I ask that this committee take a minute of silence to remember Pei Kao Lau.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I would also point out that PEPFAR care and treatment, HIV prevention, their PEPFAR programs have been reauthorized for $500 million in other appropriations as well, just in case you were not aware. We now recognize Mr. Wilson from
Mr.
South
Chairman?
Carolina. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Brian Mast, and thank you for your leadership on this very important hearing. In the past, I have supported the very inspiring messages and missions of American outreach. I have, though, sounded the alarm for abuse and wasteful spending in aid programs, sadly, for years. We've routinely seen aid diverted to dictators, such as Assad of Syria, and oppressing the very people it was meant to help. The Biden administration insanely provided and funded woke, deranged depravity in Syria instead of trying to help the people, and the UN delivered aid through the regime itself to the people as they were being slaughtered by Bashar al-Assad. Legitimate aid was diverted from the needed earthquake recovery that occurred there in Syria. Fortunately, Assad is now removed by the people of Syria, and he is in hiding, of course, in the appropriate location, Moscow, with war criminal Putin. Another example, Mr. Primarak, is the tragic example of dictator diversion, and that is in Tunisia. Once a shining success of the Arab Spring and partner in North America, it's now been turned into a full-blown dictatorship by Kais Saied. While Millennium Challenge Corporation rightfully suspended aid, USAID sent $30 million to cover unclear programs while the dictator has corrupted the economy, destroying jobs. What can be done to stop propping dictators and also aid being diverted, as you correctly identified, even to terrorists themselves? Mr. Primarak?
Yes, sir. I'm not familiar with the situation in Tunisia, but this happens a lot. I think there's a lot of goodwill in these programs. There's a lot of good programs overall. But the problem is that very often these things just go on year after year after year, and then there's no changes. We're actually propping up bad regimes and socialism. I was in Mozambique in October for the elections there. We have a Marxist-Leninist regime. They stole the election. We're spending $1 billion, $500 million to $1 billion a year. And then what happens? There's no reform. We're supporting socialism. And the government, just 2 months before we came there, provided their port in order to allow the Chinese Navy to project their power into the Western Indian Ocean. So there has to be a much better affinity between what we do on the development aid side and the diplomacy, where we put our ambassadors on the hook to make sure these things don't happen. Thank you.
And indeed, we've seen in the Republic of Georgia, the corrupted election of October, where the legitimate president, Salome Zurishvili, has been replaced by a Georgian Dream, which, as you identify, ports. Indeed, the Chinese Communist Party has taken over the port there in Georgia on the Black Sea. And simultaneously, the Georgian Dream dictatorship in Tbilisi has reached out to work closely with Tehran at the same time as Tehran has sent assassins to murder Donald Trump. With that in mind, thank goodness we have good people like our Congressional alumnus, Ted Yoho, here. And so, Ted, delivery mechanisms for aid have been co-opted by enemies of the United States running the UN. Fortunately, President Trump has appointed Elise Stefanik as the UN ambassador in the tradition of Ambassador Nikki Haley, who will stand firm for America first. Many of the nonprofits that are doing the bidding of dictators are being supported. What can we do to ensure that indeed these agencies are working for the people we're trying to help and not prop up dictators or support terrorists?
I think the biggest thing is just oversight, and we need to follow up on the oversight. We hear every year how many erroneous spending programs there are, how money's being wasted. We hear those reports, but yet when I was in Congress, I didn't see us acting. It was hard to get everybody to act, and that's where I go back to the purity of purpose and what is the mission. We have to stay within those guardrails, and we need to make sure, well, the body of Congress needs to make sure that they stay that way. And it's a tough thing. You know, if it was a static world, it would be easy, but it's a tough world.
And also in the best Florida tradition, our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has announced just last week a great letter to Chairman Mast about how they would be stepping in to identify programs and promote those that promote the people of legitimately in the world who need it. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Wilson. Now recognize Representative Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome two of my former colleagues here, Ted Yoho, who is one of the more conservative people I served with here in Congress, and Andrew Natsios, who I think is the most conservative member I served with in the Massachusetts House as a Republican, and Republican leader in Massachusetts as well. You know, I think that what we're seeing with our witnesses like this, is the fact that up until 3 weeks ago, this issue, USAID, used to be the most bipartisan issue. And I've been on this committee now for 14 years plus. We used to agree with these things. We could find things wrong with it that we can correct. And the irony of all this is this. The Republicans are in charge of the White House, the House, and the Senate. They have the power to do this the right way. They have the power of oversight to look at all the things that are being pointed out. That's your responsibility if you don't like it, and you have the power to do it. You don't need this draconian executive directive to do it. It's causing chaos, not just here in this country, but around the world. It's not necessary, and it's a huge departure from everything I've seen occurring in the 14 years before this. Along those lines, I'd like to submit, Mr. Chairman, a letter to the Republican and Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate, and it's from almost 150 former administrative officials, Republicans and Democrats, those who served in the military and the State Department, and urging the rescission of the Trump executive orders aimed at freezing our foreign assistance and dismantling USAID. It deplores the undemocratic and unconstitutional dismantling of these agencies. I'd like to submit this for the record with unanimous consent. And I'd also like to point out some other correspondence that occurred around this issue. The people that praised this action, where did they come from? I'll tell you where they came from. They came from our greatest critics, the greatest critics of democracy right now in the world. They came from the leaders of Russia and Hungary and Venezuela. They're praising this effort. That's who's for this effort. In fact, the Speaker of the Russian State Duma said that anyone who received funding from USAID should be made to publicly confess and repent on Red Square. That's who's praising this. That's who's happy with this. Putin's happy with this. This is so important now in Ukraine. One example, Putin's primary target in Ukraine is to destroy the electrical grid, to use that as an energy weapon of war against the Ukrainians in his illegal aggression. And what does USAID do? They're helping to train and give the resources so that the Ukrainians can repair these damaged electrical grids so they can keep the power on and fight Putin. Putin's happy with this. I mentioned the military leaders. General Mattis, who is also Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, he used to come to this committee time and time again and say, don't fully fund these programs like USAID, and you know what? If you don't fund it, just buy me some more ammunition. The military in our country understand the importance of this program. I've had discussions for years, and I just recently had discussions with our special operations forces. Those people, I respect them beyond words. They are in the most dangerous parts of the world, in small numbers, a global footprint, working to know where our greatest threats are in the country. They're placed in positions hosting the most dangerous threats to our country, as are so many people working for USAID, risking their lives as well, trying to secure the safety of people, not just in the world, but in our own country, from terrorist threats that are metastasizing and pose increasing threats right here back at home. They told me of the importance of USAID. They told me how they work together on security issues, on intel issues, on understanding how they can use their ability to keep us safe and use it more effectively. And they particularly pointed out what a threat China is, and it'll become a greater threat in the absence of USAID. That's who's asking us not to make these draconian changes. And you know, do it the right way. All those things you do, all the little small cuts. I won't say anything about circumcisions being a small cut. Listen, all these small cuts, you have the power to do it yourself. Do it. Do it the right way. Don't support this. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. We will write $10 million of foreskin out of the budget. I now recognize Representative Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. USAID was created through executive order in 1961 by President Kennedy, long having lost and strayed from its mission, lost its direction. Even the Clinton administration tried unsuccessfully to reform it. And we spend, I don't know, somewhere between $40 and $50 billion annually on this organization. And with the things that you hear, well, many of us, probably most of us in the room, agree with projecting America's power for the good of all the world around the globe. Quite honestly, if our enemies were asked to design a foreign aid program that would actively undermine the United States of America at maximum cost to the taxpayer, they would be hard-pressed to create a scheme more effective than USAID. That's shocking to say, but I just, it's, look, let's just go to a couple things here. We left Afghanistan, and I'll just I'll characterize it as left in August of 2021. August of 2021. So the Taliban's in charge. Taliban threatens the lives of the NGO personnel distributing USAID. They claim credit for USAID distribution. They interfere with the distribution of USAID aid. They tax the beneficiary of the aid. They tax the delivery service. They steal the food commodities. They divert the funds. They extort citizens for protection for USAID aid. They create sham procurement schemes, and they threaten the lives of those who oppose those schemes. Now,
Secretary, in the weeks and months to come, these medical students are not only worried about the prospect of losing cures, treatments, and medical breakthroughs if Mr. Kennedy is confirmed. These medical students from Oregon told me that his unwillingness to take science and medical data seriously is going to harm science for decades to come. So I ask my colleagues to think about those medical students' words. Is that a legacy you want to leave behind as a result of supporting Mr. Kennedy? Senate Democrats have been making this exact case. In his hearing before the Finance Committee, I asked Mr. Kennedy to square his anti-vaccine views with more recent statements designed to appease a number of our senators who are quite nervous about his nomination. In his testimony, he used the fact that his own children were vaccinated to prove he was not anti-vaccine. But the record shows that just a few years ago, he said he would, quote, do anything and pay anything to go back in time in order to prevent them from getting those vaccines. Elsewhere in his testimony, Mr. Kennedy stated he was not anti-vaccine, but rather pro-safety. But about 18 months ago, he said on a podcast, and I quote, no vaccine is safe and effective. In other words, Mr. President, in the Senate Finance Committee, we brought the evidence, we brought the receipts, and Mr. Kennedy said nothing to actually disavow his prior statements. He stuck by the time-worn tactics of a conspiracy theorist. Always ask for more evidence and never accept the evidence that's placed in front of you. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are now deeply disturbed by Mr. Kennedy's refusal to entertain evidence that would require him to change his mind on vaccine safety. Nevertheless, it sure looks like my Republican colleagues have bowed to pressure from Donald Trump and are poised to hand Mr. Kennedy the platform he has been seeking for 2 decades to push fringe views. So before the Senate votes, I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the fights ahead on health care. Republicans in the House are already pressing ahead this morning with their plan to kick millions of Americans off of their health insurance in order to fund more tax cuts for those who are very wealthy. And as HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy is going to be a key player in this effort. While senators were on the floor speaking yesterday, the Senate Budget Committee debated a budget resolution that unlocks the legislative tools Republicans need to make good on their go-it-alone plan. At the same time, the House Budget Committee released its own budget resolution that will be debated today. Mr. President, what is clear in both of these blueprints, in their game plan, is that Medicaid cuts are at the top of the list. 81 million Americans rely on health care coverage under Medicaid and the CHIP program for kids. Those people are folks with disabilities, low-income families, seniors, and of course children. The damage and destruction to American families if Republicans go through with their plans to gut Medicaid cannot be overstated. Take nursing homes, for example. 2 out of 3 nursing home residents are currently being covered for their health care by Medicaid. Imagine you visit your mom in her nursing home in the months after the Republican bill makes steep cuts to Medicaid. Your mom complains there are fewer and fewer staff. She had to wait more than an hour after calling for help to use the bathroom on several occasions. Next time you visit, she tells you some of the new staff don't have time for her. You learn that the facility no longer has the resources to conduct background checks and that they're desperate for workers. A few weeks later, the facility manager pulls you aside to deliver some bad news. Her nursing home can no longer accept patients with Medicaid after steep federal cuts to the program. Unless you can find another facility that accepts Medicaid, you've got to pay the high monthly costs out of your own pocket. Suddenly, and with no warning, you've got impossible options. Either you scramble to find the money to cover a new facility that costs thousands of dollars a month, or you bring your mom home with you. So between holding down a full-time job and raising young kids, suddenly you have to deal with making sure that your mom gets full-time care, and that requires nursing assistance around the clock. Unfortunately, this case I described is something you see in every nook and cranny of America. I know that from my days as co-director of the Gray Panthers. And I know that many of your friends and neighbors with aging parents and grandparents in nursing homes are facing the catastrophe that I've just described. Now, Republicans are going to do somersaults to disguise their cuts to Medicaid, and they're going to describe it in health care lingo that they think plays well with people. For Republicans, every single child, senior, or family struggling to pay the bills that gets denied coverage is a win. And that brings us to Mr. Kennedy. During his confirmation hearing on everything from abortion to vaccines to Medicare and Medicaid, Mr. Kennedy was given ample opportunity to go on the record about how he would improve these programs, bring down costs, save taxpayers money, and improve care. Instead, he showed a complete lack of understanding of the basics of Medicaid and how it functions. I personally believe it shouldn't be too much to ask for the future CEO of Medicaid to understand how important it is to provide affordable coverage for millions of families. Republicans, with Donald Trump at the helm, are steering our country toward a health care cliff. Their ultimate objective is to take away Medicaid from as many people as they can. Colleagues, so much for making America healthy again. What the American people need is a leader who will be the voice of reason in the room as Trump and his assistants in Congress start slicing and cutting. Our country needs a leader at Health and Human Services who's actually going to work to improve care and lower costs, defend the reproductive freedoms of families, and listen in particular to facts and science. The American people have no reason to believe, based on the record, the evidence that the Senate Finance Committee has accumulated, to believe Mr. Kennedy will be that leader. There is no question the health care system in America needs reforms. It's falling short, and Democrats want to work in a bipartisan way on those issues. We are disillusioned by a system that puts profits over patients in too many circumstances. Nobody on this side of the aisle is arguing for the status quo. But the solution, colleagues, and I'm closing with this, does not lie in Donald Trump's, quote, concept of a plan to make our country less healthy less safe, and less successful. When kids are kicked off their Medicaid coverage and forced to go without basic medical care and grow up with chronic illnesses that leave them in a lifetime of pain and suffering, Republicans are going to regret any vote they give to Robert Kennedy. When seniors are told they have to vacate their nursing homes because it no longer accepts Medicaid, Republicans again will regret a vote for Robert Kennedy. When families are struggling to pay the bills and they're landed with a mountain of medical debt because their kid got sick and they were kicked off their insurance, finally Republicans will regret any decision they give, any vote they give to Robert Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy will no doubt be right alongside Republicans, a willing participant in this future for health care that I've described today that is really stepping back from progress that has been made. I urge a no vote, colleagues, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of his confirmation. Contrary to the attacks that have constantly been made on him, he has made it very clear that he will support safe vaccinations and just wants to see that the research on them is done and done well. When his nomination for the role of Secretary of HHS was announced, Mr. Kennedy stated, "We have a generational opportunity to bring together the greatest minds in science, medicine, industry, and government to put an end to the chronic disease epidemic facing Americans." I agree with him. We've got to get into the business of making America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy's dedication to this commitment has been apparent throughout the nomination process. He will bring a fresh perspective to health care, prioritizing consumer choice, information transparency, and early interventions to strengthen the well-being of all Americans. He has been responsive to a wide variety of questions from members on both sides of the aisle, appearing before 2 committees and answering hundreds of questions for the record, not to mention going through the extensive vetting process of the Finance Committee, which I chair, which is the most extensive vetting process that any candidate in the Senate goes through, for a position in this administration goes through in the Senate. While some of my colleagues continue to question his financial agreements, Mr. Kennedy met and then exceeded the requirements set forth by the Office of Government Ethics. Mr. Kennedy has participated in one of the most extensive processes, as I've said, that our Senate puts a nominee through, and has succeeded in meeting those standards. And I encourage my colleagues to support his nomination. Now, before I close, I want to respond briefly to the comments that we've heard today here on the floor and all day yesterday in a long Budget Committee hearing to set up the first reconciliation legislation to come before the Congress. It was said today that Republicans are going to take Medicaid away from children. They are going to take health care away from seniors. It was said yesterday that we were going to go after pretty much old people, young people, middle-aged people, and every other kind of people, because we are going to destroy the support base that they have here in the federal system. The fact is, this is the politics of fear, the politics of claiming things that are going to happen which are not going to happen. The reality is that yesterday's Budget Committee meeting was not on health care. There was nothing done in the meeting yesterday that would have done any of the things that you've heard on the floor today. What we did do yesterday was to set up a process so we can provide some significant extra spending authority to our government to close the border and deport the violent criminals who have come into our country in the millions in the last few years. We had another provision in it to give significant new resources to our national defense so that we can build back our Department of Defense and the authority of those in our armed services, the ability of those of our armed services members to have the technology and the equipment and be capable of responding to threats to our nation. And finally, we restarted and charged up our use and engagement in producing America's energy in America so that we can get back into the business of being independent and not relying on other nations for our energy policy. Those are the three things that we focused on in the committee yesterday. And by the way, each one of those was a little bit costly, and every one of those was offset so that there was no increase in federal spending. Mr. President, I think we need to argue over facts when we get into these debates. We're going to have a tremendous number of debates. And yes, we will debate on health care at some point. But yesterday, and what we did yesterday, was focused on the border, on national defense, and on reboosting our energy production in America. I encourage a strong yes vote for Robert F. Kennedy to be the next Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent for 1 minute for an opportunity to respond to my colleague from Idaho.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would only say to my friend from Idaho that he says this is not going to happen, that people are going to be safe and seniors on Medicaid and the like will be safe. I would just say to my colleague, it starts today in the other body of Congress. I'd say to my colleague, the process of setting in motion these cuts to essential health care services begins today. We can read about it in the publications about the congressional schedule. I look forward to working with my colleague when we can find common ground. But on this point that it's not going to happen, everybody's going to be safe, the efforts to cut these vital programs, including Medicaid, begins this morning in the other body, and I yield the floor.
Could I have 30 seconds to just respond? I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would simply say that we hear this every time we look at trying to address the spending excesses in our government. And I will just say to my colleague and to everyone, we're not going to take health care away from children. We're not going to take health care away from adults, from seniors, or middle-aged people. We are not going to attack the benefits that people get under Medicare. And frankly, we will reform some of the spending, yes, but we will not do all of the terrible things that are being spun up to try to attack this effort to control the excessive spending in our government.
Democrat leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the fact that we're here right now, that we're even here right now, voting on this wildly unqualified conspiracy theorist to trust with one of the most life or death jobs, HHS Secretary, charged with protecting the health of every single American, should be an affront to every senator and the millions of Americans that will be impacted by this horrific nomination. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I implore you, think one last time about this vote. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know the consequences of what you're doing. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know how dangerous this is. My colleagues on the other side, you know you are not putting your constituents, their health, their families first when you vote yes. To quote my colleague, the junior senator from Texas, just a few years ago, he said, quote, "We need an expert. We need a scientist. We need someone who knows something about health care heading the Health and Human Services Department." Well, which is Robert Kennedy? An expert? A scientist? Or what about the senior senator from Louisiana, the chair of the Health Committee, and a well-respected medical professional himself? A few years ago, here's what he said. Previous HHS secretaries have had a pharmaceutical industry background, have been a state health commissioner, have run health systems, have been governors. Somebody who has had a background in actually administering the programs that HHS administers. I ask my colleagues, which of these qualifications does RFK possess? You know the answer, none of them. The question in front of this body today, the question in front of this body is not simply to confirm RFK to run the nation's health department. The question before us is very simple. Which is more important to you? The health and well-being of your constituents, or blindly obeying orders, knowing full well the dangerous impacts your vote will enable? I plead with you one more time, rethink this issue. This is dangerous. This is wrong, very wrong. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the Kennedy nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durr.